Okay, I am joined today by one of my absolute favorite people in the endo space, Katie Edmonds, who also happens to be the author of Heal Endo, the best book on endometriosis, in my opinion. So, Katie, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for your time today. We don't really have a theme per se. I guess the theme of our conversation today is more interesting, kind of out of the box topics and endometriosis. So I'd love to just start off with a brief intro. Who are you? What makes you a great person to talk to on endometriosis and things related to endometriosis, and then we'll deep dive into some of our interesting topics.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk endometriosis with another endo nerd. Great minds. Yeah, my name is Katie Edmonds. I am an author. I have written two books, Heal Endo, an Anti-Inflammatory Approach to Healing from Endometriosis, as well as just a straight up recipe book, the 4-week endometriosis diet plan. I'm a nutritional therapist specializing in helping women specifically heal with endometriosis, and I have a pretty extensive blog that's very free. It's healendo.com, which talks about everything endometriosis is and how to get better. And something that is different, I think, for both of us is we're not saying it by any means that holistic is the approach we should always take with endometriosis. We use the term integrative care often. And I think that's just so important for the whole endometriosis community to understand that there's many factors that go into creating endometriosis and progressing it, and there's many factors that go into healing from it. So when you look at it from this perspective of, I say I have 99 problems and endometriosis is just one of them, that's
Mhm.
kind of where this conversation can tie in, that we often have a lot of other things going on besides the endometriosis. And then when we remember that endometriosis is a full body disease, it's not a full body disease because you can find endometriosis lesions anywhere. Like that's one reason why. But it's
Mhm.
also because there's so many things in the body that they have gone haywire, so to speak, and that contributes to the endometriosis, pathogenesis, progression, symptoms, etc. And endometriosis then can also put pressure on your systems, your other systems, to make them go haywire. So it's this conversation that's forever ongoing. So in some ways, we can't address endometriosis lesions, right? The only person who could go in and remove those is a surgeon. But if we look at the 99 other problems that can be influencing endometriosis, then we stand a chance at reclaiming our lives in some amazing ways. I personally have found complete remission of my endometriosis symptoms. I don't know what my lesions are doing. I haven't had the benefit of doing ultrasound yet. I am so looking forward to that technology.
Mhm.
But I never knew remission was possible. So this is kind of what spurred my interest in actually researching endometriosis, digging into PubMed and saying, how come we hear there's no cure, but some patients are getting so much better? It's like they don't have the disease. And why are some patients not getting better, right? Like where's the difference and what can we do? So that is a very long form answer to your question, but that's who I am. And those are kind of the words that I preach.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I'm curious, Katie, what does you achieving remission look like?
Yes, so I had terrible endometriosis symptoms. I never was able to afford an excision surgery, and so I kind of thought everything was hopeless. I live in the state of
Mhm.
Hawaii. There's no excision surgeons here in
Mhm.
the state. So you have to travel out of state, which means no insurance at all will cover it. And you're paying out of pocket to not just stay to fly, but you have to stay for a few weeks, right? So I was looking at $60,000. This is many years ago. And when I started to do research into endometriosis, and I realized it wasn't necessarily a genetic condition, like it wasn't just there. There were things that influenced it. It is an inflammatory condition, so many similarities, something like autoimmune disorders and cancer. And when I
Mhm.
started to apply those approaches, I found all of my symptoms started to disappear. And some things that were terrible was like chronic fatigue. And
Mhm.
I see all these symptoms as a silver lining that I lived through them. And I think that allows you to have so much empathy and compassion and understanding for what people go through.
Mhm.
Like chronic fatigue is
Mhm.
terrible. It's like you're not
Mhm.
tired. You can't just like drink some espresso and get on with it. You like kind of a corpse, right? Like it's really hard to function. So I had chronic fatigue like that for years and years. And it was within a few weeks of kind of actually implementing changes to address that at the cellular level. I was doing all this endo diet stuff before, the stuff, like cutting out all of the food groups and, eating low fat almond milk and cereal sort of thing. I felt this fog lift from my body. Like I could see green on leaves again. Like I could feel the
Mhm.
breeze on my skin. I was like, felt like I was coming back alive.
Yeah.
And since then, my unexplained infertility went away. I have two, we're just talking, very energetic young children now. I have the energy to keep up with them. My endo pain was actually all the time, except for my
Mhm.
period, which was so interesting. It was like this chronic, debilitating, heavy pain, but at the period, it kind of went away. So that's gone. I don't have any endo pain anymore. Basically, every symptom that I was suffering from is completely gone, um, without an excision surgery. I never recommend like that's the thing, right? Because some people absolutely need surgery. I got very lucky considering where I live, that I
Yeah.
didn't need one. But that's an example of one person's story in finding remission. That I am now 39. I say I'm healthier than I've ever been in my life,
Mhm.
which is so cool. Looking back and I look at my like late 20s and oh man, I was kind of like an 80-year-old woman. It was
Mhm.
really real crotchety and slow and stiff
Yeah.
and all the things. So, that's my kind of my story of remission and where I am now. I'm just like a normal, healthy person.
Yeah, what a beautiful story of hope for people who are watching and or listening that, it very well could be possible for you.
Yep,
And like you alluded to, certainly some people need the surgery. We are
100%.
not saying that surgery is not a management option you shouldn't pursue. That's absolutely not what we're saying. But yeah, like you said, there's so many things in the body that contribute to us having these endometriosis symptoms and the way that the endometriosis behaves. So in your intro, you mentioned exactly that, right? That there's all these systems, and then other symptoms can follow from those systems that impact the endometriosis lesions, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yep.
one topic actually that you recently posted about in your blog that is so fascinating and so out of the box. I do these Q&As on my Instagram every couple of weeks, and somebody actually dropped a question about this topic, redundant colon. And so I'd love to, deep dive that topic, since this chat is about, interesting kind of out of the box topics around endometriosis. So uh, I'd love to kind of segue into that and talk about what it is
Yeah.
and
Did that
how it impacts.
person have a redundant colon? Were they asking you about it? They said they have one.
I don't think she said that
Oh,
she had one. I think she was just curious about it because I'm assuming she saw your post and she was
okay.
curious, yeah, on my thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a super obscure thing that I would never have stumbled across had I not been diagnosed with one. And yeah, so I did a research deep dive into it, and I'm sure you could link to that blog in the show notes. But
Yeah.
I have dealt with constipative tendencies since I was a little kid.
Mhm.
And it was never like really bad IBS-C, like life altering. It was never like that. So I didn't pay a ton of attention to it. It was just something that would like crop up, especially if I was not on top of like certain diet and lifestyle stuff, if I was like at my worst and not moving a lot, right? All the things that can play into constipation. But it was after my dad died. This is 2 years ago. I developed this severe pain, very acute in my upper right quadrant. So, he died of esophageal cancer, colon cancer runs in my family. I'm like, I should just go get this checked
Mhm.
out. And from the process actually of having the colonoscopy, you have to drink all this like laxative, right? And not eat for 2 days. It is so fun, really fun.
Yeah.
But it was through that process, I came out of the colonoscopy feeling like the pain was gone. And I was like, well, that is so weird because it was pretty cute. It was following me around. It was so
Mhm.
sensitive and tender, bloated and puffy looking. I'm like, oh, do I have cancer? Is something else going on? And the gastroenterologist, he was just such a gem, being sarcastic. He complains to me about how challenging my colonoscopy was because I have this long, wiggly, large intestine and really, really like, made his day hard. And I was like, what? He's complaining to me about me? Like this dude is so out there. And I would have totally like not paid any attention to it had the pain not have disappeared. So I looked at the follow-up notes and, it was like pathology fine, everything normal, patient has redundant colon, and then it went on to just say how everything was normal. So nothing here was pointed out. And I've talked to other patients who have had a redundant colon diagnosis, and it's kind of the same thing. It was just mentioned offhand, like not a big deal, couldn't possibly be a problem, go on with your life. So it was like I stumbled into it, but being the researcher I am, I started to look into it more and realize just how much this can impact an issue like constipation, create things like acute pain in some areas, lead to things like big time bloating, big
Mhm.
time constipation, pelvic floor dysfunction, core dysfunction, so highly associated with so many of the issues that those of us with endometriosis may be dealing with. And on top of that, there's not very much research on redundant colons. We can talk about that in a minute. But it did show, there's one study that showed 31% of women who had bowel endometriosis also had a redundant colon. And that goes in line with other research saying about 30% of those with chronic constipation have a redundant colon.
Mhm.
So you say, oh, 30%. What if it is like 30% of all those of us with endometriosis and chronic constipation have one of these? So because this is a video, because no one really, this is pretty much all video, yeah, that people watch on YouTube.
Yeah. Yep.
I print out pictures. I just love
Oh,
pictures.
that's awesome.
Okay. Because just so we can start distinguish. Okay, so like what is a redundant colon? My husband loves to just use the word redundant now. Um, so I, didn't understand anatomy too much before I got into diet, nutrition, and health. So for those of you who are like me, we have two different intestines, right? You have the small intestine, which is it's like your nutrient absorber. It's where extra carbohydrates are broken down. So much of your immune function is trained here. It is an entirely different world than your large intestine, which is the big ropey kind of picture frame that we have here. This is where the majority of the bacteria in your gut is held. Like the vast majority, billions times more than your small intestine, your stomach, anywhere else. So when it comes to fermentation, this is where fermentation happens. Very important to note, this is where water absorption happens right in
Mhm.
here. And as the water gets absorbed and the fermentation happens, out comes excrement in the form of poop, obviously. So an average long intestine, or large intestine, also called the colon, is about 5 feet long. That's an average. Maybe if you're a short person, yours is a little shorter. If you're tall, it's a little taller. Now, if you have a redundant colon, it just means you have extra length. It can also be called a tortuous colon, although that also usually includes a little more twists and loops, and I'll show you some pictures of that. Or a too long intestine. This is a picture of a redundant colon that is slightly longer. You can see it's probably about a foot longer, and it
Mhm.
comes up and has to loop in here, right? Because you're not growing more abdomen in order to fit your large intestine. Your large intestine just needs to fit in your abdomen.
Yeah.
So that's like 1 foot. Now, here's some pictures because no two redundant colons are the same. This is from a study, and I have it on my site. But you can see it here, all of the different twists and turns and
Mhm.
loops. The ones that go up really high, like into your thoracic cavity. That could be
Mhm.
something that I could consider about where that pain was coming from. Because when you have redundancies, like redundant colon of this type, right, with this many loops and twists, you can get fecal compaction in any of those twists, and it can start causing pain if it's not moving through. Hence, if you take a strong laxative to move everything through, which in my case ended the pain, I believe that was probably the case, as I had some sort of impaction from the trauma of my dad dying, eating terribly, being chronically dehydrated, just crying for days. But when you put it together, there's a lot of things that can happen when you have that long of an intestine. So the worst case that I stumbled upon was a woman who had 10 feet of extra intestinal tract
Oh
removed. This is
my
a
gosh.
Mayo Clinic thing. So this is like worst case scenario. That means she had 3 colons in her, 3 large intestines worth of length, right? She had her
Oh
five
my
feet,
gosh.
plus she had 10 more feet. Now, if you really start to imagine how extra length can play into the digestive challenges that we are dealing with, as well as things like the dysbiosis tendencies that nearly all of us with endometriosis have,
Yeah.
the inflammation, right? And then the enormous amount of pressure, because you're not just dealing with extra tube, you're dealing with that tube that's filled with fecal matter,
Mhm.
gas, water, right? Like all of the things that fermentation creates, you can now look extremely bloated or distended all the time because you simply have a lot more mass. With all that mass, then it can push down on your pelvic floor. So you can deal with things like pelvic floor dysfunction, chronic pain with sex, urinary issues, all contributed by this, by the colon. Is that really loud? Someone just started weed whacking outside.
I can hear it. I can hear it.
Okay. Do you want me to ask him to stop?
Is your window open?
I could run downstairs and ask him.
Is it your husband doing it?
No, it's like the yard guys though.
Oh, um,
If it's
I
it
mean,
might not.
it's coming and going. Like it was
Okay.
loud and now it's a little bit quieter.
Okay.
So,
Sorry, everyone. We have a lot of yard.
no, that's okay.
Okay, shut that window.
Yeah. Yeah, so helpful. When I was reading your blog, and I have also had experiences with patients who have this diagnosis, not a ton. I was surprised to read that, it affects, I think the statistic you had in your blog is 31%, right?
Mhm. It was
31
31% of women with bowel
with
endometriosis,
bowel
but it's still,
endometriosis.
in general, across the population, about 30% of anyone who deals with chronic constipation.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, the first thing that I thought of, I know that there's so much more to be said about redundant colon, but all that extra length, the first thing I thought of was, wow, the additional opportunity for absorption of like recycling or reabsorption of toxins, waste
Yeah.
hormone, especially, right, with endometriosis. So yeah, like you've already kind of alluded to this a little bit, Katie, but what are the implications, right? Why do we want to intervene if the redundant colon might be something that applies to our listeners? And maybe what are some of the top ways that we can intervene here?
Yeah, I think, well, first, let me say just having a redundant colon, it doesn't mean you're going to have lifelong constipation. There's plenty of people who have a redundant colon that have no symptoms. So it doesn't mean you have to have symptoms. And there's also people who don't have a redundant colon that deal with chronic constipation, right? So it's not like it's the thing. It just kind of adds one more thing to manage or consider as far
Right.
as your treatment plan. So, with anyone who's dealing with chronic constipation in the endo world can have the exact same issues. Like you're saying, a detoxification issue. Like you need to be pooping very consistently in order to keep moving things outside of your body, like all of the cellular trash, all of the toxins, like the excess hormones, everything that's going
Mm.
through you. If it's sitting there, it has so much more chance to absorb, right? That's definitely a huge one. Um, the 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 situation between intestinal methane overgrowth, IMO, and constipation is really big as well. And since we know there's a really high association between like SIBO and IMO and
Mm.
endometriosis, making sure that you are having consistent bowel movements is one of the only ways to know that you are going to be able to address something like IMO, the
Mm.
methogen overgrowth. So, if you're never addressing that, you're always going to be having the dysbiosis, which we know is highly associated with the progression of endometriosis, with the inflammation, around endometriosis. The word I use is endoing. It's a verb, and it refers to all of the processes that we know provoke endometriosis into growing, spreading, turning into worse forms of disease, right? So if you're never allowed to end the dysbiotic trend in your own intestinal tract, like it can just stay long term. And like I said, like the pelvic floor dysfunction and core dysfunction, I talk at length about these things in my book. They're different, the
Mm.
core dysfunction and pelvic floor dysfunction, but they're both so intertwined with the pain and the ending of bloating, pain with sex, all of your organs being pushed down, that lower belly bloat, all of those things, they're all interconnected. So you absolutely need to make sure that you're having smooth bowel movements. And when you're taking this into consideration, that you might have a lot more intestinal length going on, there are absolutely some things that we could consider. Um, to start, because this could apply to everyone with constipation,
Mm.
so many of us don't drink enough water. And I
Mm.
had a client before, and she was the sweetest, sweetest woman. She had dealt with chronic constipation for so long, and she'd been to all these gastroenterologists. This woman was drinking 2 cups of water a day. I kid you not. And no one had ever intervened and said that soda doesn't count. Her thing, she really liked to drink sodas
Mm.
with caffeine in them. And she would have a caffeinated tea in the afternoon. So she was drinking, but she didn't realize the things that she was drinking could be dehydrating to her.
Yeah.
So your large intestine is where water is absorbed, right? So if you're drinking 2 cups of water, cool. Well, that will get you through the first, foot of your large intestine. Well, you
Hmm.
got 4 more feet to go if you have a normal sized large intestine. Maybe you have like 7 or 8 more feet to go if you have a redundant colon. So you really, really have to stay hydrated. And that means if you have a redundant colon world, like, 10, 12 cups of water per day, and adding your additional water if you are drinking dehydrating substances like alcohol and caffeine and sugary sodas, right? So that one can help you limit those dehydrating things because that's really quite a lot of liquids to drink. But to make sure that you're getting that in every single day is really important. The other thing is to ensure that you're eating foods that draw water into the bowel, especially if you have longer, you need to make it further so that, when you have a constipated stool, it comes out like hard, right? Like a
Mm.
pellet. And it's a pellet because it doesn't have any water left in it. Like it made it to the very end of the intestinal tract and there was no water at all to help move it through. So that's, shows how important the dehydration, the rehydration is. So when you include things in your diet to help absorb water into the intestine, then that can help move things along. So there's things like soluble fiber. Something that can be helpful is taking like a psyllium husk pill, 1 or 2 with your meal. So not in between meals because you want to draw in water wherever your food is, not in between. And it can mix up, and then that along with the water can help draw water in. But I say in my blog to really, we need to be aware of fiber as well and not just say, I think this is kind of a recommendation we hear, well, eat a ton of fiber. If you have a very long, large intestine where fermentation is happening, you may do, sorry, was that mine? You may do very well avoiding that much fiber because
Mm.
even a healthy amount of fiber has the potential to ferment way too much if you have twice the length of large intestine, right? So this is
Mm.
going to be something that you have to play around with to see how much fiber you need in your life. But something that helped me was doing lower FODMAP because we know that FODMAPs are super healthy, right? You
Mm.
never want to be on a low FODMAP diet long term. It's a great as a short term. I don't know about you. I really love to recommend low FODMAP short term just to get people into a place where they're having extreme symptoms, so you could address dysbiosis or see where they're what they're reacting to. But if you're going to do something longer term, it could be just lower FODMAP. So instead of a whole avocado, you're doing a quarter of an avocado. So you're still getting the beneficial fibers into your system, but just not at the same rate as someone who's not dealing with that same level of fermentation.
Mm.
A supplement that can help, and this is actually, I guess, take a step back. This is one reason why I think a diagnosis can be helpful for redundant
Mm.
colon, is that you have to learn how to manage it long term. And for me, like as a root cause practitioner, I kept looking at my body being like, why am I doing all the things right? And I still trend towards this constipative pattern. Like,
Mm.
what is the root cause? There must be something there. And it turns out like I just have a way longer large intestine.
Yeah.
So, for someone who's dealing with constipation, you don't want to rely on like a laxative or magnesium citrate long term. But if you do have, this actual physical issue, you may need to. So, magnesium citrate, it's not the best magnesium to raise your tissue levels because what it's really good at is drawing water into the bowel, which is why it's really helpful for people with constipation. That mag calm is basically just magnesium citrate.
Mhm.
Someone who might just take 100, 200 milligrams a night, and that would be really helpful for them. If they took 500, 600, 700 milligrams a night, they would have explosive diarrhea, right? So
Mm.
if you have a large intestine, you might find that you need 5 to 800 milligrams a night to have really consistent bowel movements, that it just helps the water and all of the food, everything in your intestine move down that very long twisty tube smoothly without getting stuck, right? That's why you need the extra water and to stay in the bowel. Um, you just want to play around with it. So you'd never say, oh my gosh, I have a redundant colon, or I'm dealing with chronic constipation. I'm just going to start at 800 milligrams because that could end up really bad. Start at 200 to 300 milligrams of magnesium citrate and do that for a night or two. See if that helps you wake up and have a bowel movement. Then just move up. You move up 100 milligrams a night. See, because over time it can also make a difference. Like maybe you get up to 600 one day and it helps, but then you realize it's too much long term. And every night you're doing good with 400 milligrams every night. But just maintaining that consistency is so important. So those are kind of the foundational things, like water, drinking water, and then drawing water into the bowel. That's like a chemical addition that you just need to have. Um, Movement is huge because when you have that much large intestine, if you're sitting all day or you're very sedentary, it's gonna just sit there, right? And you want it to have peristalsis, which is the movement of the intestinal tract, which is, it moves and propels everything inside along. There's stories of people with too long intestines that part of their intestinal tract actually ended up dying, like the nerve system in it, because it became so impacted for too long that those nerves died. So these people are going to have peristalsis issues for a long time. And that would be down the line for someone to consider, if they're not having any success, to consider surgery, which would be absolute last ditch effort.
Resort. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you never want to have a bowel surgery for no reason. There's too many complications that can go wrong. But just for the sake of understanding why it is really important that, this fecal matter can get stuck, you walking, you running, jumping, doing things that allow those insides to move, it can be so helpful. If you've traveled and sat for a few days on end, or been really probably studied for college, right? Those exam times where you're just like sitting all day, and you realize how much that impacts your digestion. Well, so many of us are very sedentary due to chronic pain, or due to our society, which does not promote a very physically active world, that if you can start to prioritize that in whatever way works best for your body, your pain level, your threshold. I'm not saying go jump on a trampoline, right? I think the worst thing a lot of women with endo need, but go for a long walk every single day. And those are the foundational things that you can think to start the process of everything moving along before you jump into more complex things. Like if you're going to move into testing for IMO or SIBO and addressing it, you will never be able to address it. I would never recommend addressing it without having consistent bowel movements, because you're just going to be killing off all that bacteria and then absorbing all of the endotoxins and all of the LPS, because it's not any way out of your intestinal tract. So before you move on to the more advanced options, you need to force yourself somehow to have extra bowel movements. So those are some of the things. Something also I really think is important to address when we have these bigger bellies, like I would describe mine at times as totally distended, back when it was like I had really bad endo belly, in addition. And now it's like, having the extra long intestine, I see like I am lean enough to have a very flat stomach, but I never will because I just have the extra large intestine. So the tendency of society is, we'll slap some Spanx on that, right? Like cinch that in. Please don't do that. Like if you need to do that to feel really great going out for a night with the girls or whatever it is, like by all means, don't, I'm not heckling anyone here. But when we use those modern day corsets to hold ourselves in, imagine you have a bag and it's the size of an abdomen, and you can put your 5 feet of rope in it, right? 5 feet, and it fits perfectly. Well, now shove in 3 more feet. Okay, your bag is expanding, right? Society says, oh, we don't like that. That stomach's not flat enough. So you Spanx it in, squish. Where does it go? Straight down onto your uterus, onto your pelvic floor, onto your fallopian tubes. It lends to the thing we're talking about previously, core dysfunction, etc. So the more you can actually lift your organs off your pelvis, and it actually takes deep core strength to do that. So you can think, well, short term, I'm not going to do the Spanx, but long term, I'm going to be working on retraining my core function and strengthening my deep core so I can lift these organs, which I have more organs than normal, back up. There is a process, and someone I recommend is called Hypopressive Training. That's the specific type of training that I would recommend for this. that training changed my life from having all of my organs stuck really low to now having
Mm.
them what I would consider pretty well organized up in a proper placement. But it does take a lot of work, and most of us don't have deep core strength
Mm.
at all. So it's really cool. If anyone's interested, the person I recommend is Angie Mueller, and she's at it's the corerecoverymethod.com. And so you can do an online class for that too.
Can you tell us a little bit about, like, is there a Coles Notes version of like what that is and maybe what it entails in terms of the types of exercises you might do? I'm assuming it's some form of like I've read your book, I've seen your videos. I know that there's like a special form of breathing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so core dysfunction refers to a dysfunction in how your core is functioning. And most of us have no idea, right? Like every system has a proper way to function, like a swallowing pattern. So many of us have
Right.
swallowing dysfunction, right? There's also core function. So what your core does is it keeps all the contents of your abdomen in place when under pressure. Because when you squeeze your abdomen, it's not like air comes out, right? It's like your organs move around. They're all under pressure. They're not under high pressure. You don't pop when you get cut in your abdomen. So no one really thinks about that pressure. But what is it is a lot of pressure. So when you breathe in, you're adding, say, like a melon size bubble of air into your
Mhm.
abdomen. You are not growing a bubble out your vagina, at the same time. It's not like the pressure does that. The pressure is inside your body. It's controlled here. So when you have core dysfunction, it ends up that pressure is dysfunctional. So the way you should handle something like breathing is that your entire rib cage should open so that your lungs have room to expand. Your diaphragm, it widens, so it's flat, but it widens and maybe it descends just a little bit.
Mhm.
But if your rib cage is locked, as so many of ours are,
Mhm.
like when I started learning how to breathe properly, I could barely open my rib cage at
Mhm.
all.
Wow.
And that means your diaphragm has to descend deep. What that does is it pushes all of your organs down onto the pelvic floor and the uterus. So that would be deep belly breathing, which is so great when you're lying down and you want to actually relax the pelvic floor, relax the insides. But if you're doing it while you're standing up or sitting down against pressure of gravity, it's really challenging, especially if you're doing it every single day. On top of this, you develop some issues with how you breathe. It's almost like a reverse pattern of how your diaphragm descends. So you can kind of try this test at home to see if your breathing pattern is correct or reversed. Is you can either cough, or I kind of changed it a little bit to have a flower. If you imagine you have a flower and you're going to blow the petals off really, really hard. So put one hand on your tummy to feel what it's going to do.
Mhm.
Take a breath, blow. Now, did you feel your stomach suck in towards your belly button as you blew out? That would be good, because as the air exhales, the stomach contracts, it pulls in, it supports your organs, and your air goes out. If you found that your tummy bloated out while you were
Mhm.
pushing, that shows intra-abdominal pressure that's mismanaged. It should
Mhm.
not do that. Your belly should not blow out when you are sneezing, coughing, running, jumping, blowing petals off of flowers. If you are exhaling and your belly is protruding when you do that, it's in reverse, a reverse pattern of how it should be. So
Mhm.
you need to retrain this, because it's not necessarily something you think about, right? When you sneeze, you're not thinking, "Oh, I need to control my belly at this moment." It's your nervous system. It's part of like a sense of your body knows how to behave without you thinking about it.
Mhm.
So to retrain this, the way that I know and has worked great for me is hypopressive breathing, and it is a form of breathing and inhalation and breath holds. So it's very different than Wim Hof, or there's all kinds of meditative breathing. This is a specific exercise to retrain core function. And what you do is you breathe in through your rib cage very wide, and you can feel like you're suffocating at first if your ribs aren't used to opening. You basically have to strengthen your intercostals, the little muscles between your ribs, so that they relearn how to expand and open your rib cage.
Cool.
And then And you do that. It's kind of hard to describe on this way, but then there's a breath hold as well. So when you breathe like using your ribs, not your belly, and then after 3 times you hold your breath without air in your lungs. So you exhale, hold your breath, and you suck up. And when you suck up, you are actually lifting all of your organs off of your
Mm.
pelvic floor, and you do that in different positions. So again, it's really hard to kind of chat about without visuals. I have really specific videos on my website we could link to for people who are interested in
Sure.
how that looks. But over time, you do this every day consistently, and it's almost like visualization training, right? You visualize yourself being strong, you visualize yourself having energy, and over time, you actually do have more energy, or you feel more strong. It's you retrain your core function every day, and then after a month or 2 months, you realize that you sneezed, and for once, your belly went in. You didn't think
Mm.
about it, but it just functions correctly now. So that's how my core is now. I went from a totally dysfunctional core to a core that is functioning optimally, even with my very long, large intestine. So there's so much hope there. And if you can fix your core dysfunction, all of the pressure of the organs squishing down, that offers your pelvic floor so much opportunity to
Mm.
heal. Because so many of us with endo not only have a stiff atrophied pelvic floor, you add in the pressure of all of those organs, 11 pounds of organs constantly hitting it, and it actually, just like clams up more or less. It's actually stuck in a spasm, which is
Mm.
what a hypotonic pelvic floor is that most of us suffer from. And that can be the cause of the pain or even
Mhm.
contribute more to the constipation, right?
Right.
So even having a redundant colon, one of the best things that a doctor can do for you is recommend you go to a pelvic floor physical therapist.
Yeah. And there's a lot of literature on pelvic floor physio for pain management, for pain with
Yeah.
intercourse, defecation, urination. So I imagine that that's life changing to people with
Hmm.
endo who have that underlying dysfunction for sure. I hate to bounce around like this, but I did want to. This really probably should have been my first question before we got into the redundant colon conversation. But I mean, naturally, if you suspect that you may have this, you'll probably want to get a diagnosis. It sounds like that's through a colonoscopy.
There's a few different ways to get a diagnosis.
Okay.
There's a barium enema.
Okay.
Um,
Like a swallow
so
study?
you, what was that?
Like a swallow study?
No, like an enema where they put
Oh.
barium, like it's not like radioactive fluid, but like for imaging, yeah, you get
Yeah.
an enema of it
Okay.
all the way up, and then they take an X-ray. So there's that. There's MRI, and then colonoscopy. If it's not an actual number one way to diagnose it in the literature, but they can if they're measuring. So, the colonoscopy camera only goes so long, so it actually won't be able to make it all the way to your ileocecal valve if you have
Mhm.
too long of a large intestine, which was my case, and why my gastroenterologist was so annoyed with me. So it was almost like you can get diagnosed, but it's not necessarily the best way.
Right.
Um, but there is, it's one of those things that is also challenging that some of your doctors may not think it's a big deal,
Mhm.
that you don't need to get a diagnosis. You definitely will have to be referred to a gastroenterologist because your GP probably will have no idea what you're talking about if you start talking about a redundant colon. So you will most likely have to advocate hard for getting a diagnosis. Maybe not. Maybe you have like a really great doctor.
Yeah.
But in my case, I was lucky to have it diagnosed almost like by accident.
Yeah. So what I was going to ask is it a bit of a stretch? Like, okay, I want to preface by saying, yes, always seek out that diagnosis, but is it a bit of a stretch to say, if you're somebody who's really on top of your diet, you're eating
Hmm.
fiber, you're moving your body, you're hydrating really well, maybe you've consulted with a nutrition professional or something on hydration, you've been
Hmm.
given the green light that, yes, you are in fact consuming an adequate amount of water. Maybe you're having some odd, uh, upper right quadrant pain, or maybe it's kind of closer to the lower right or something like that. I mean, that could be many things, of course. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it's definitively a redundant colon, but if the list of these symptoms that kind of correspond with redundant colon applies to you, is it a bit of a stretch to say, yeah, that might be in fact what you have? What would your comment be on that?
Yeah, right. It's kind of that would be me, to a certain extent, like really checking all the boxes and still dealing with these issues. Yeah, you easily could. And it's not like you're saying, oh, now you need to go on medication, right? Like that can
Mhm.
have all these side effects because you have this. It's saying, okay, now maybe you consider that, yeah, you do need 500, 600 milligrams of magnesium citrate every night, maybe for the rest of your life. And instead of thinking like, oh, it's a crutch, I just need to find this root cause, if that is what's helpful, and if that is what allows your stool to flow freely, and that stops any little areas of pain that you may have been suffering with, then totally. You don't need necessarily a diagnosis. For
Yeah.
me, it was really helpful to have because I was able to stop thinking about it in a way like,
Sure.
oh, that just makes so much sense. So if you're someone like me, a little more like stuck in your head, getting a diagnosis can be really helpful as well. But I totally agree. Like, as we started the talk saying, having one doesn't mean you're always going to have constipation. And, you could just think that maybe it's something else that's contributing.
Yeah. And I want to come back to something you said, which is the large majority of us don't drink enough water. Many of us don't eat enough fiber. If you're not having bowel movements because you're not eating enough fiber or not hydrating well, redundant colon might not be the first thing that
Yeah.
you jump to, right? Like we need to establish those foundations first. But
Mhm.
yeah, if the symptoms and your lifestyle align, then perhaps this is something that might apply to you if you're listening and you're kind of checking off the boxes. And certainly you can seek out a diagnosis, but none of the interventions that Katie spoke about today are harmful. Certainly increasing your hydration, trying some psyllium husk, adding in what was the other thing I was thinking? Like adding the soluble fiber sources. I know in your blog you talked about Entrentil, which we didn't talk about today. Um,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
yeah, which is something, it's basically like a natural product that helps with reducing methane production, right? The methane gas production.
Yes. Yeah, I think maybe it's worth talking about that for a second because that was life changing for me. Antentriol is, you hear it talked about for addressing IMO in the SIBO world,
Mhm. Yeah.
because it helps absorb methane. It's like three different polyphenols, and so it
Okay.
almost sounds too simple. But if you have a extra long large intestine and you're dealing with methane, it's not all of us have methane species in our gut.
Yep.
Some of us do. Unfortunately, if you have like redundant colon and the methane, you're kind of dealing with two things that can antagonize each other. So for me, actually taking Antentril with every meal has been so life-changing as far as just keeping things moving along because methane itself, it causes constipation. It stops peristalsis. So it contributes to it just having the methane gas, kind of like constricts your
Mhm.
intestines up.
Mhm.
So you want to get rid of that methane gas, which is why it's like why you can't get rid of the SIBO or the methane overgrowth until you have bowel movements, but it's hard to have a bowel movement when you have the methane overgrowth. So this is where
Exactly.
Antentril can be really, really helpful for some of us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a helpful tool. I've only used it with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, like methane dominant. And now, in light of this conversation, there you go. I'm definitely going to keep my eyes peeled for this collection of symptoms.
Yeah.
Great. I don't know, Katie, we're almost at about the hour, so I don't know if I should go into this next topic, but I think that was a nice overview of redundant colon.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to talk about, but when there's so much overlap between many of the
Yeah.
symptoms, and then a lot of us too are just given this annoying diagnosis of IBS-C as if it's something, right? And all it means is you have all the symptoms of chronic constipation. But like,
Exactly.
let's dig in more. Like, what is actually going in and how do we address it? And for many of us, we haven't actually addressed the root cause issues, right? Like that poor client who had seen all the gastroenterologists and no one had recommended that she drink more water. So there's the
Right.
foundations. And then if you do have this congenital thing that is always going to be with you, like how do you support your body in addressing it? And hopefully this can help some of those women out there suffering like I was.
Mm. Yeah, and it's not ideal if you're just being given this IBS-C, IBS constipation type diagnosis and not really being given any direction to
Mhm.
improve these symptoms as somebody with endo because, constipation is something that you have within your control, in the sense that there are things that you can do to improve it. And that goes a long way for supporting your symptoms of endometriosis. You want to be getting that waste out. You want to be getting that hormone out. It is not like a permanent state you should be in. You really should be making efforts to improve the constipation for those reasons. So I think a very insightful conversation, whether our listeners, suspect they may have redundant colon or not. I think there was a lot of valuable information in there for just helping to resolve a constipation, the importance of having those routine bowel movements, and all the positive spillover effects into those for endometriosis symptoms. Did you have any final thoughts, any little nuggets of information on those topics that we talked about today around the pelvic floor dysfunction, the redundant colon, constipation?
I have, it's sort of like we only have a minute or two, but I have more on my site. I do mention surgery and prokinetic agents. There's like a few different
Yes.
other things to take into consideration. So if you think you might have a redundant colon or you have one, you can just, check out the blog and all of the information will be there.
Yeah, and I will link to that in the show notes as well, so nobody has to go digging for it. We'll put it in the show notes, and then you can read Katie's wonderful, comprehensive blog post on the topic. Okay, excellent. Well, I just want to thank you so, so much. Extend my gratitude to you. I know you're very busy, so I really want to thank you for your time in discussing this interesting out-of-the-box topic with me, and I hope that our listeners found it really interesting and informative.
Yeah, I'm psyched to be here. Thanks for having me, Cindy.
Of course.